In the stunned silence that followed the storm of gunfire, the people of Huntington, West Virginia, were left with a grim spectacle on their courthouse lawn, the body of a dead stranger. He was a man who didn't belong, a ghost from the bloody plains of Missouri, laid low in the heart of Appalachia. His death wasn't an answer. It was a question mark written in blood on the town's doorstep. How did the most infamous outlaws in American history, the James Younger gang, end up so far from home, leaving one of their own dead in a desperate, bullet-riddled retreat? Today, we will answer that question and unravel a story of Appalachian grit colliding with legendary evil. To understand the shock of that day, you have to understand the world that was shattered. Huntington, in 1875, was not some quiet mountain hollow lost to time. It was a city with a swagger, a raw and muscular town born from coal dust, steel rails, and ambition. Forged just a few years earlier by the railroad magnate Collis P. Huntington, it was the proud western terminus of the Chesapeake and Ohio Railway. It was a place where the ancient rhythm of the mountains met the thunder of the locomotive, a boomtown humming with the promise of a new industrial Appalachia. At the very heart of this vibrant new world, on the corner of 3rd Avenue and 9th Street, stood the Bank of Huntington. It was more than just a building of brick and mortar. It was the town's beating heart. Through its doors flowed the lifeblood of the region, massive C&O payrolls for the railroad men, the hard-earned wages of miners who clawed wealth from the deep hills, and the fortunes of the industrialists who were taming the wilderness. This bank wasn't just holding money, it was holding the collected dreams and sweat of an entire community. The guardian of this trust was a man named Robert T. Oney, the bank's cashier. He was a man of ledgers and ink, of quiet respectability and steady habits. His world was one of predictable order, of days measured by the familiar clicks of the telegraph and the comforting clang of the vault door swinging shut. That afternoon, his son was with him in the bank, learning the family trade, surrounded by the symbols of security and civilization. For them, the world was a safe and logical place. Outside the bank's windows, the town bustled with activity, a testament to its newfound importance. But beyond the last paved street, the ancient Appalachian hills rose up, dense and watchful. These were the old mountains, the ones that had seen empires come and go, their hollows filled with secrets and shadows. They formed a stark contrast to the noisy, forward-looking city at their feet, a wilderness that could swallow men whole, a perfect landscape for both escape and ambush. But progress is a double-edged sword. The very thing that made Huntington a beacon of prosperity also made it a target. The same steel rails that carried coal out also carried stories in. Tales of the C&O payrolls, of the fat new bank on the Ohio River, traveled west on telegraph wires and in the talk of rail riders. These whispers reached the ears of men who saw progress not as an opportunity to build, but as a chance to take. Unseen and unheard, a shadow was stretching from the Missouri plains, drawn eastward by the irresistible scent of a prize that was simply too rich to ignore. On the sweltering afternoon of September 6, 1875, the first clue that something was wrong arrived on horseback. 8 strangers, cloaked in long, dust-colored coats that seemed oddly heavy for the heat, rode into town. They moved not like weary travelers, but with a chilling purpose, their eyes scanning the streets with a predator's focus. There was a disciplined silence about them that felt more menacing than any drunken shouting. For the citizens of Huntington, they were an unnerving puzzle, a whisper of trouble on the wind. The puzzle quickly turned into a portrait of terror. 4 of the riders dismounted in front of the Bank of Huntington. As one stood guard at the door, a sentinel of violence, the other 3 stepped inside, their heavy boots echoing on the floor. Within moments, the routine calm of Robert Oney's afternoon was obliterated. A $5 bill was offered for change, a simple transaction that became the trigger for a nightmare. As the cash drawer opened, a Colt revolver appeared, massive and unarguable. The outlaw's voice was calm, almost conversational, which made his words even more terrifying. "We are the James boys. We have come for the money." The scene inside was one of cold, professional plunder. While Oni and his son were held frozen under the barrel of a gun, the other men moved with a terrifying efficiency, vaulting the counter and stuffing bags with the town's wealth. The scene spoke not of a desperate smash and grab, but of a rehearsed, military-style operation. The outlaws knew exactly what they wanted, from the loose cash to the contents of the new, modern vault. Outside, the other four horsemen turned 3rd Avenue into a shooting gallery. They galloped back and forth, firing their pistols into the air, their shouts echoing off the brick buildings. This wasn't random chaos. It was calculated terror designed to paralyze the town and suppress any resistance before it could begin. For those first few minutes, the street was a bewildering landscape of noise, smoke, and fear. The crime scene wasn't a static place of discovery. It was a living, breathing storm of violence. The questions came in a panicked rush. Who were these men? Why were they here? Was this the end of their town? The wilderness wasn't in the surrounding hills. It had ridden right into the heart of Huntington, and it offered no easy answers, only the immediate deafening report of a dozen six-guns. In the days that followed the raid, as the story was pieced together from 100 terrified accounts, the first and most obvious suspect was not a single man, but a ghost. It was the ghost of the Confederacy, a phantom born from the raw, unhealed wound of the Civil War. You see, this wasn't just a bank robbery. To many people, especially those with Southern sympathies, this was a calculated act of war, a personal vendetta waged against a symbol of Northern power and occupation. The motive was as clear as a mountain spring to anyone who had lived through the conflict. The Bank of Huntington was the financial heart of the C&O Railway, a Yankee enterprise carving up the ancient hills and imposing a new order on the land. To a man who had lost his home, his kin, and his cause fighting for the South, that bank wasn't just a building full of money. It was a monument to his defeat. Robbing it wasn't simple theft. It was a righteous blow against the conqueror, a desperate attempt to reclaim a sliver of lost honor and pride. Whispers quickly turned to the methods of the crime itself. The initial evidence was in the execution, the cool discipline, the expert horsemanship, the terrifying efficiency. This wasn't the work of common thieves or local hotheads. This was the cold arithmetic of combat, the tactics of seasoned cavalrymen who had learned their trade in the brutal guerrilla warfare of the border states. Locals who had fought in the war recognized the style immediately. It was the same ruthless precision used by the partisan Rangers who had terrorized Missouri and Kansas. It wasn't long before a name was put to this ghost: Jesse James. The name was already legend, spread by dime novels and sensationalist newspapers. He was cast as the avenging angel of the lost cause, a man who had never surrendered. His history as one of Quantrill's most fearsome raiders was well known. The story fit perfectly. The raid on Huntington was seen as a natural chapter in his ongoing war against the banks, railroads, and authorities that represented the Union. For many, the case was closed before it had even been properly opened. The perpetrators were the James Younger gang, and their motive was vengeance. But as the dust settled and the adrenaline faded, a more unsettling question began to snake its way through the back rooms and taverns of Huntington. Was it really that simple? The James Younger gang were ghosts from another world, strangers in this rugged Appalachian terrain. How did they know the exact day the C&O payroll would be in the bank? How did they navigate the town with such confidence? And more importantly, how did they know the perfect escape route? A direct line into the tangled wilderness of Wayne County, where a posse would be useless. The cold, horrifying answer began to form. They couldn't have known. Not on their own. Suspicion began to fall not on a man with a gun, but on a man with a pen, an insider, someone within the C&O Railway or even the Bank of Huntington itself. This suspect had no public feud or bloody history. He was a trusted face, perhaps a quiet clerk who saw the river of money flowing past his desk while his own share was but a trickle. Or maybe a telegraph operator, a man who translated the secret clicks and dashes that detailed the movement of fortunes he could never hope to possess. This man saw the wealth of the railroad barons firsthand and felt the bitter sting of his own small place in their grand design. His motive wasn't vengeance for a lost cause. It was the timeless, ugly engine of greed and resentment. He was a man who felt cheated by the very system he served. He saw the easy money waiting in the vault and saw the outlaws from Missouri as a tool, a violent key to unlock a future he felt he was owed. Providing them with a map, a schedule, and the layout of the bank would have been his ticket out of a life of quiet desperation. When re-examined through this lens, the outlaw's actions took on a darker shade. Jesse James's supposed inspection of the new vault wasn't just bravado. It was the remark of a man who had been told to expect it. The gang's immediate and unerring flight to the 9th Street Bridge was no longer a lucky guess, but the execution of a pre-planned route. This theory was terrifying because it meant the enemy wasn't just an external force that had stormed the town. It suggested that a Judas had been living among them all along, a man who had sold his neighbor's safety for a bag of stolen silver. The betrayal, hidden behind a trusted face, felt far more sinister than the open violence of the raid itself. There was, however, a third theory, one that was whispered in the boardrooms and telegraph offices far from the dusty streets of Huntington. This theory suggested the crime wasn't born of Southern pride or an insider's greed, but was a cold, calculated move in a much larger, more brutal war. It was a war fought not with cannons, but with contracts, spies, and when necessary, hired guns. This theory posited that the James Younger gang were not the masterminds, but merely the bloody instrument of a powerful external force. The target, in this version of events, wasn't just the money in the vault. The real target was Collis P. Huntington himself and his burgeoning C&O empire. In the cutthroat world of 19th century railroad expansion, rivals like the Baltimore and Ohio were locked in a ruthless struggle for territory and resources. Huntington's success as the C&O's western hub was a direct threat to their interests. What better way to cripple a competitor than to strike at his proudest achievement? A brazen, violent robbery would send a clear message. Huntington is not safe. The C&O cannot protect its own assets. Your investments, your payrolls, your very lives are at risk in this lawless Appalachian outpost. In this scenario, the James gang becomes a scalpel in the hands of a surgeon dressed in a three-piece suit. Someone with deep pockets and a complete lack of scruples could have easily sent a pathfinder like Bill Chadwell to Missouri with an offer, a handsome fee to sow chaos, plus whatever they could carry out of the bank. This would explain the gang's incredible gamble in traveling so far into unfamiliar territory. It wasn't a whim, it was a contract. They were mercenaries hired for an act of corporate terrorism. Looking back, some locals remembered unsettling signs in the months leading up to the raid. They recalled strangers in fine city clothes, men who didn't belong in the rough and tumble town, asking pointed questions about railroad shipping times, land values, and the bank's security. At the time, they were dismissed as investors or surveyors. But in the bloody aftermath, their presence took on a sinister new meaning. They were the scouts for an economic predator, the advance guard for an attack designed not just to empty a vault, but to shatter the confidence of an entire city and derail the ambitions of a railroad king. In the minutes after the gang thundered across the 9th Street Bridge, Huntington's shock curdled into pure, unadulterated rage. A posse, a mix of grim-faced lawmen and ordinary citizens turned avengers, plunged into the tangled wilderness of Wayne County. They were fueled by a righteous fury, certain that a swift and bloody justice could be found just around the next bend of the Guyandotte River. They followed the fresh tracks, believing the outlaws' brazenness was matched only by their foolishness for choosing such a difficult escape. Their greatest hope was the wounded rider, the one who had slumped in his saddle. A man that badly hurt couldn't go far, they reasoned. He would slow the others down, leave a trail. They scoured the forest floor for a speck of blood on a leaf, a hastily discarded bandage, any sign of a man faltering. But they found nothing. The tracks led them deeper into a labyrinth of creeks and hollows, a green, suffocating world that seemed designed to hide fugitives. The trail grew cold, the hoofprints scattered and vanished. It was as if the forest itself had conspired with the outlaws, swallowing them whole. Frustrated, the posse turned its attention to the theory of an insider. Suspicion fell on any known Southern sympathizers living in the rugged hills between Huntington and Kentucky. Men who had ridden with the Confederacy were rousted from their farms, their homes searched, their families questioned. But this tactic backfired spectacularly. They were met not with confessions, but with a wall of stony silence. These mountain folk, already distrustful of authority, closed ranks. Every question was answered with a shrug, a blank stare, or a muttered, "I saw nothing." Instead of uncovering a conspiracy, the posse only managed to sow deeper resentment, chasing shadows while the real culprits slipped further away. Days later, they straggled back into town, their horses lame and their spirits broken. They returned not with prisoners in tow, but with the bitter taste of failure in their mouths, their clothes torn by briars and their faces etched with exhaustion. The only proof the gang had ever been there was the body of Tom McDaniels, a silent, decomposing trophy that offered no answers. The initial blaze of heroic defiance had died down, leaving behind the cold embers of fear and the growing, terrible realization that the most dangerous men in America had come to their town, bled their streets, and simply vanished. The posse's failure in the hills of Wayne County was about more than just rough terrain. It was a collision with an invisible, impenetrable fortress. It was a confrontation with the ancient mountain code, an unwritten law far more powerful than any statute passed in a distant state capital. As the lawmen pushed deeper into the hollows, they found that people's eyes grew guarded and their doors closed a little tighter. Men who would normally share a story and a dipper of water suddenly had nothing to say. Women would call their children inside and the world would go quiet. This wasn't simple ignorance. It was a deliberate collective act of forgetting. To understand it, you have to understand the soul of Appalachia. This was a land settled by people who had come to escape authority, be it from kings across the ocean or tax collectors from the flatlands. Here, loyalty was not to a government, but to blood, to kin, and to your neighbor. You didn't talk to the law because the law had never done a thing for you, except maybe try to take your land or your moonshine. Justice was a private matter, handled with a handshake or, if necessary, a shotgun. The fear of retribution was a palpable thing, as thick as the morning fog in the valleys. Everyone knew what happened to those who talked. A fence might be cut in the dead of night, letting the livestock wander off. A prize hog might turn up sick. A barn, the very symbol of a family's livelihood, could go up in flames from a single well-placed lantern. These weren't idle threats. They were the grim language of mountain politics. Helping the law against men like the James Gang, men who, to some, were still seen as Confederate heroes, was seen as the ultimate betrayal. It was choosing the side of the outsider against your own. And so, the wall of silence held firm. A farmer might have seen 8 riders pass his gate, their horses lathered and one man slumped low. A woman drawing water from her well might have heard the desperate gallop and seen them disappear up a hidden creek bed. But when the sheriff came asking, they saw nothing. They heard nothing. They knew nothing. Their silence was a shield, protecting them not only from the outlaws' revenge, but also from the intrusive world that lay beyond their ridgelines. The truth of the Huntington heist was lost somewhere in that silence, buried deep in the unmappable country of a community's fear. For years, the story of the Huntington heist remained frozen in time, a brutal but unresolved chapter in the town's history. The outlaws had vanished, the money was gone, and the wall of silence in the hills had proven unbreakable. The official investigation withered on the vine, leaving only folklore and speculation. But the truth, as it often does, was lying dormant, waiting for an accidental turn of a key. The turning point didn't come from a sheriff's investigation or a lucky posse, but from a place far away, a consequence of the gang's own arrogance. 1 year later, in September of 1876, the James Younger gang rode into Northfield, Minnesota, expecting another easy conquest. Instead, they rode into a buzzsaw. The townspeople fought back with a ferocity that dwarfed even Huntington's resistance. When the gun smoke cleared, Bill Chadwell and Clell Miller were dead in the street, and the Younger brothers were captured, grievously wounded. The invincible aura of the gang was shattered forever. It was in the aftermath of this disaster that the forgotten clue from Huntington finally resurfaced, not as an object, but as a confession. Held in a Minnesota jail, facing a lifetime of hard labor, Cole Younger began to talk. He spoke of the gang's history, their motives, and their methods. When questioned about the audacious raid so far to the east, he confirmed the long-held suspicion. He admitted that the gang had indeed robbed the bank in Huntington, West Virginia. He spoke of the fierce street fight and the desperate flight into the mountains. Most importantly, he gave a name to the man who lay in a pauper's grave on the courthouse lawn, Tom McDaniels, a trusted member of their deadly fraternity. This confession was like a lightning strike in the dark. It traveled back to Huntington on telegraph wires, a voice from a Minnesota prison cell that finally broke the Appalachian silence. It wasn't a hidden map or a dusty journal. It was the unvarnished truth from the mouth of one of the perpetrators. It transformed the dead outlaw from a nameless stranger into a specific villain. It validated the stories of the townspeople who had fought back and confirmed that they had faced down the most legendary criminals of their age. The confession didn't recover the stolen money or reveal any local conspirators, but it provided something just as valuable: certainty. The ghost that had haunted Huntington for a year finally had a face. For a full year, the identity of the Huntington Raiders had been a ghost story, a legend told with a mix of fear and a strange, grudging respect. The name Jesse James was on everyone's lips, but it was a name spoken like a folktale character, a boogeyman from a distant land. There was no proof, only the chilling style of the crime and the whispers that followed. The town was left in a state of suspended animation, knowing they had been violated, but unable to officially point a finger at the specters who had ridden through their streets. The unmasking, when it came, was not a sudden discovery, but a cold, hard confirmation that the legend was terrifyingly real. The news from the Minnesota jailhouse swept through Huntington like a cleansing fire. Cole Younger's confession was the final, irrefutable piece of the puzzle. The ghosts were finally dragged from the realm of myth and into the harsh light of reality. They were not phantoms. They were men of flesh and blood, now with names that could be written in a ledger of crime. The dead outlaw on the courthouse lawn was no longer an anonymous casualty. He was Tom McDaniels. The wounded rider who vanished into the hills was, as many had suspected, Cole Younger himself. And the cold-eyed leaders who had calmly announced their intentions in the bank were none other than Jesse and Frank James. The full roster of the culprits was now known, a rogues gallery of the most wanted men in America. Jesse James, the charismatic leader, his brother Frank, the quiet killer, the formidable Cole Younger, the hardened veterans Clell Miller and Bill Chadwell, and the ill-fated Tom McDaniels. They were the core of the gang, a brotherhood forged in the guerrilla wars of Missouri, and they had brought their private war to the doorstep of Appalachia. And what was their definitive motive? Was it a noble act of Confederate defiance, as the dime novels claimed? Was it a complex plot of corporate sabotage? The confession, stripped of all romance, laid the truth bare. The motive was far more primal and far less glamorous. It was money. By 1875, the James Younger gang were no longer soldiers fighting a lost cause. They were professional thieves. Their past as Confederate partisans had given them their skills, their ruthlessness, and a convenient moral justification for their crimes. But their war was over. Their business had begun. The C&O payroll and the bank's deep vaults were simply the largest, most tempting prize they had heard of in years. The raid on Huntington was a strategic business decision. They were drawn east, not by ideology, but by the scent of a fortune. The polite manners, the supposed Robin Hood persona, it was all a carefully crafted myth, a public relations campaign for a gang of killers. The Unmasking revealed that beneath the legend of the Southern Avenger was the cold, simple heart of a predator. Huntington was not a symbol to be defied. It was a treasure chest to be cracked open by any means necessary. The afternoon air inside the Bank of Huntington was thick with the lazy heat of late summer, smelling of paper and brass polish. That peace was shattered by the thud of heavy boots. As Robert Oney looked up, the world tilted. The man across the counter offered a $5 bill, but his eyes were cold, holding no warmth of commerce. As Oney's hand went to the cash drawer, the outlaw's hand went to his coat. There was a soft whisper of leather, and then the massive dark eye of a Colt revolver was staring at him. The hammer being cocked was the loudest sound Oney had ever heard, a metallic click that sealed the moment in time. A calm voice cut through the silence, and the world of order and ledgers was gone, replaced by the simple, brutal law of the gun. Oney and his son could only watch, frozen in a state of primal fear. The raiders moved with a terrifying grace, a ballet of plunder. They vaulted the teller's cage as if it were a pasture fence, their long coats flaring. There was no fumbling, no hesitation. Their hands, accustomed to reins and triggers, swept stacks of currency and coins into canvas sacks with a rustling, clinking sound that was a sickening parody of a normal bank transaction. One of them paused to look at the new vault, the town's pride, and spoke a few words of mock admiration before emptying its contents. It was a performance of absolute dominance, designed to break not just the bank's locks, but the spirit of the men inside. Outside, the street had become a vision of hell. The four mounted outlaws were orchestrating a symphony of terror. They galloped from one end of the block to the other, a whirlwind of dust and menace. The air cracked and popped with the constant discharge of their pistols. It wasn't aimed fire. It was auditory violence, a deafening declaration of ownership of the street. Windows on the second floor of the St. James Hotel shattered, the tinkling of glass lost in the unending roar. For the people of Huntington, peering from behind curtains and doorways, it was a waking nightmare. Their town was no longer theirs. It was a stage, and they were the terrified audience to a terrifying show. But the paralysis of fear can only last so long before it hardens into rage. The outlaws' barrage was suddenly answered. The sharp crack of a squirrel rifle from a hardware store doorway joined the deeper boom of the Colts. A window flew open above the dry goods store, the glint of a shotgun barrel appearing for a second. The symphony of terror became a discordant duel. The air, already thick with smoke, grew hazy, a rolling fog of battle that obscured figures and turned the street into a landscape of lethal guesswork. The hunters had, in a shocking turn, become the hunted. As the gang burst from the bank's doors, their bags heavy with loot, they ran headlong into this new reality of organized resistance. They were no longer performers on a stage, but soldiers caught in an ambush. In the chaotic scramble for their horses, amidst the rolling cloud of gunsmoke, one of the riders suddenly stiffened, a marionette whose strings had been cut. He pitched sideways from his saddle without a sound and fell, a dark, motionless shape against the bright dust of the street. His panicked horse, now riderless, bolted after the others. In that same hail of unseen lead, another rider lurched forward, grabbing the pommel of his saddle as if struck by a giant, invisible fist. His hat flew from his head, but his powerful frame clung to the horse, his body contorted in a silent struggle against an unseen force. He did not fall. The remaining outlaws dug their spurs into their mounts, their disciplined operation now a frantic, desperate flight. They thundered towards the 9th Street Bridge, a mad dash for the safety of the wilderness, leaving the echoes of their violence hanging in the air. When the last hoofbeat faded, a ringing silence descended upon the street. The smoke slowly drifted away on the afternoon breeze, revealing a scene of surreal stillness. Shattered glass glittered on the boardwalks, and there, in the middle of the street, lay the still form of Tom McDaniels, a final, grim testament to the fact that on this day, the people of Huntington had fought back. In the aftermath of the raid, there was no grand trial in Huntington. There was no solemn judge, no jury of 12 peers, no eloquent lawyers arguing points of law. The only trial that ever mattered for the James Younger gang in West Virginia took place in a 90-second span of chaotic gunfire on 3rd Avenue. The jury was a hardware store owner with a rifle, a clerk with an old army pistol, and a dozen other anonymous citizens who decided that their town was worth defending. The verdict for Tom McDaniels was delivered not by a foreman, but from the barrel of a gun, a swift and final judgment that required no appeal. Instead of a courtroom, the town had the courthouse lawn. McDaniel's body was dragged there and put on display, becoming a gruesome pulpit from which the town preached a silent sermon of defiance. Crowds gathered to stare, their faces a mixture of grim satisfaction, morbid curiosity, and lingering fear. This was justice in its most raw and primal form, a public spectacle meant to reassure the community that an invader had been repelled and a price had been paid. A coroner's inquest was held, a brief formality that concluded, to no one's surprise, that the outlaw had died of justifiable homicide. He was then unceremoniously buried in a pauper's grave, his story in Huntington ending as it began, a nameless threat, now a nameless corpse. The real legal reckoning came a year later and hundreds of miles away in a Minnesota courthouse. It was there that the captured younger brothers faced a formal system of justice. There was no defiance in their demeanor, only a stoic, weary acceptance of their fate. Cole Younger, in particular, was calm and cooperative, his confession providing the final, authoritative chapter to the Huntington raid. They pleaded guilty to their crimes in Minnesota to avoid the spectacle of a trial and the near certainty of a hangman's noose. They were sentenced to life in prison, a verdict that was celebrated in the North as a triumph of law and order. But for the people of Huntington, it was a distant echo, a hollow victory. The Youngers were being punished for Northfield, not for the terror they had inflicted upon West Virginia. The money stolen from their bank was never recovered, and the two men most responsible, Jesse and Frank James, remained free, ghosts in the wind who had escaped Appalachian justice entirely. And so, the final verdict for the Huntington heist was a deeply unsatisfying one, an empty chair at the defendant's table. Jesse James would eventually be killed by a traitor in his own gang, and Frank would surrender and, through legal maneuvering, walk away a free man. No member of the James Younger gang was ever convicted or even formally charged for the crime committed in Huntington. The town had won the battle in the street, but the masterminds of the war had gotten away clean, a bitter injustice that still lingers in the hills, a story of a crime that was punished but never truly prosecuted. The gunsmoke over Huntington eventually cleared, but the lives it touched were never the same. The raid was a flash of lightning that left a permanent afterimage burned into the soul of the town and its people. For Huntington itself, the brutal afternoon became a defining moment. It was a scar that, over time, became a badge of honor. The city was no longer just a proud boomtown of the railroad. It was the town that had stood up to the James gang and drawn blood. The men who had grabbed their rifles and fought back became local legends, their stories told and retold until they became a part of the city's foundation myth, a testament to the fierce, self-reliant spirit of Appalachia. For Robert T. Oney, the cashier who stared down the barrel of that Colt revolver, life was cleaved in two. The quiet, orderly life before the raid and the rest of his days after. He had looked into the eyes of the most famous outlaws in America and survived. He carried that memory with him always, not as a source of fear, but as a quiet mark of resilience. He remained a respected figure in Huntington, a living link to that historic day, a man who had been at the very epicenter of the storm and had held his ground. But the fates of the outlaws were also irrevocably altered. You see, for the James Younger gang, the Huntington heist was a victory that planted the seeds of their destruction. It was here, in these Appalachian hills, that they first encountered a civilian population that was not easily cowed, one that would fight back with lethal fury. The death of Tom McDaniels and the serious wounding of Cole Younger were a shock to their system. They had won the money, but they had been bloodied and forced into a desperate, humiliating retreat. It was a dress rehearsal for their own funeral. 1 year later, emboldened by their success but failing to heed its warning, they would face that same citizen rage in Northfield, Minnesota, a fight that would shatter the gang forever. The cloud of suspicion about an internal betrayal eventually faded, but it left a lingering chill. The raid forced the community to look at itself, to wonder about the loyalties of their neighbors in a way they never had before. It strained the delicate trust that holds a town together, a wound that healed slowly over time. The raid became a shared trauma, and in surviving it together, Huntington forged a stronger, harder identity. And what of the masterminds? The James brothers, who had escaped West Virginia's justice, could not outrun their own violent destiny. Jesse James, the charismatic leader, would be shot in the back of the head years later by a coward in his own gang, killed for a reward. Frank James, the quiet brother, would eventually surrender and, through a series of controversial trials, live out his days as a farmer and a reluctant celebrity, a ghost from a bygone era of American violence. Their lives and the lives of everyone they touched that September day were forever intertwined, bound together by the echoes of gunfire on a Huntington street. If you stand on the corner of 3rd Avenue and 9th Street in Huntington today, you won't see the bank that the James gang robbed. That building is long gone, replaced by the glass and steel of the modern city. But while the bricks have vanished, the story has soaked into the very ground beneath your feet. The memory of that day doesn't live in a monument. It lives in the whispers that still drift through the Appalachian air. This is a story that has become a permanent part of the region's folklore. Ask an old-timer about it, and their eyes will light up. They'll tell you the enduring legend of Cole Younger, wounded and barely clinging to his horse. The tale goes that he was secretly taken in by a Confederate sympathizing doctor deep in the hills of Wayne County, nursed back to health in a hidden cabin while the posse searched fruitlessly. There's no hard proof, of course, but in these mountains, a good story holds its own kind of truth, a truth about loyalty and the old codes that never really die. And then there's the gold. Like a promise whispered on the wind, the legend of buried treasure persists. For over a century, people have believed that in their frantic escape, the gang was forced to bury a portion of their heavy loot somewhere in the tangled wilderness between Huntington and the Kentucky border. Treasure hunters, armed with folk tales and a stubborn hope, still comb the creek beds and scour the hillsides, searching for Jesse James's Appalachian gold. The most tangible trace of that day is a void. Somewhere in Huntington, in an unmarked pauper's grave, lies the dust of Tom McDaniels, a permanent silent resident from Missouri. And the bridge they crossed is gone, replaced by a modern span of concrete. But the real echo through time isn't made of stone or bone. It's the hollows and creek beds of Wayne County, the very landscape of the escape. The city's memory may fade with each new generation, but the mountains themselves hold the story, etched into their ancient, silent faces. They remember the thunder of hooves, and they've kept the secret of that desperate ride ever since. We began this story with a question mark written in blood on a courthouse lawn. How did the most feared outlaws in America end up so far from home, leaving one of their own dead in a West Virginia street? We know the answer now. They were drawn here not by the ghosts of the Confederacy, but by the simple, powerful magnet of greed. They came for the C&O Railroad's gold, believing their own legend would be enough to paralyze a town with fear. They misjudged their target. They expected to find timid sheep, and instead found a den of wolves. But the true lesson of the Huntington heist is not about the audacity of the James gang. It is about the ferocious courage of ordinary people. This is a story of how a young Appalachian city, barely 4 years old, refused to play the part of the victim. It's a story that proves that history isn't just written by famous men with guns. It's forged in the split-second decisions of nameless citizens who decide that enough is enough. The iron will of the men and women who carved a life from these mountains proved to be a far more formidable weapon than any outlaw's revolver. So the next time you hear the romantic tales of Jesse James, the Robin Hood of Missouri, remember the truth of what happened here. Remember the hardware store owner with his rifle, the cashier who refused to break, and the town that bled but did not bow. This is a story of how character is revealed by chaos, and how a community's soul can be forged in the crucible of 90 seconds of gunfire. It's a testament to the enduring, unshakable spirit of these hills. And now, my friends, you know the rest of the story, or at least as much of it as the mountains are willing to give up.